Hey, what's up, everyone? We are live. This is the Manny Bernabe show, and we are live across YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So say hi. Tell us where you're tuning in from. And today, I've got a very special guest, Kris Patel, who is on the show, who is going to help us decode Palantir. So here's the background. I did a video on Palantir from an Industry 4.0 perspective or an IoT perspective. That's my background. That's where I come from. Essentially, how do we use data and AI and machine learning to streamline manufacturing, logistics, things of that nature? And I did a video on Palantir, and it just got a lot of traction, a lot more traction than I would have thought for it being around Industry 4.0. And so I started stumbling on some really interesting figures in the community and started seeing just how passionate people were about Palantir. And I said, "Wow, there is something here. There's a phenomenon going on here. I hadn't expected such a an interesting retail investor group." And so we have Kris Patel, who is kind of has been a part of that group for some time now. He's going to give us an insider's view on why people love Palantir so much. What's the story? What's the hype? How much of it is real? And so, Kris, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure. How you doing, guys? My name is Kris Patel. I right now I work in healthcare IT. I do a lot of software implementation work. There's a lot of products that we are starting to see in our healthcare area. A lot of them specifically deal with AI, and it's always interesting to see like some of the newer technologies that are out there. We don't right now use Palantir Foundry, but I definitely feel that there is some space for a product like Palantir Foundry to kind of come in and take over some of the market share for things that kind of support our, I don't want to call it a business, but pretty much support our industry. Right now, we are heavily tied into ERPs like most organizations. Palantir, I think, has some opportunities to really work to, I don't want to call it displace, but I guess displace some of those incumbents and actually gain some traction and some market share because there are still a lot of areas where there's silos where we're trying to break these silos down. I mean, one of the areas that for my personal experience, I can tell you is a lot of the hospitals, even about 20, like about 10 years ago, operate in a very siloed environment where a lot of data was not shared between us, even among hospital networks. You'd still have hospitals that pretty much operated very independently. So there's a lot of work coming down the pipeline with regards to integrating not only supply chains within the healthcare industry, but other parts of it so that we can better utilize our resources. So an example is, if you have patient workloads on one hospital and, they're becoming excessive and you have a sister hospital within, let's say, 5 to 10 mile radius, how can you figure out a way to schedule that patient to another hospital in a more seamless way? Well, one of the things that we have right now is our EHR has the ability to let us do multi-facility scheduling. But there's other factors that kind of go into that outside of just scheduling patients to other facilities. There's also supply issues that you have to contend with. There's logistical issues that you also have to integrate yourself with. So right now, if you're trying to integrate multiple hospitals within a healthcare industry, within a healthcare system, there's still a lot of complexities out there that have to be figured out in order to kind of successfully transition to that more of a digital model where you have a very seamless experience from one place to another. So
Perfect.
yeah,
And
that's where
Kris,
I'd start.
that's a great intro, and I'd love to jump in here because I did in my video on Palantir, my strength slash weakness, because the way I framed it is usually your strength is also your weakness. Um, but my strength slash weakness was that Palantir got started in the government space, and the strength there was that that's a very strong moat. It's hard to get into, but once you're in there and you're doing well, it's hard for other people to compete against you. And I feel like healthcare is the same way. Like once you're in healthcare, you're like, man, it's really hard to penetrate that space, and you're gonna have it to yourself for a little bit. And the example that comes to mind for me is Epic. Epic is this software company
Yeah.
based out of Wisconsin. It's privately held, but it's probably, I don't know, like 75% of market share
I think it's a
for.
little less than that, but it's a significant player. I mean, the two main dominant EHR systems that we work with are Epic and Cerner. Like, if you go to any hospital, medium to large size clinic, 9 out of 10 chances you're either going to run into Epic or you're going to run into Cerner, or an iteration of either one.
Got it. And so I guess I'm wondering, why is it so Cerner was recently purchased by Oracle, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you paid attention to that, or how do you think that's gonna shake out in your space?
I would say that it doesn't necessarily impact my organization very much because it's pretty much just a new master. So instead of just one company doing it, you just have another kind of overlay on top of it. I don't think that there's any structural changes that Oracle's really going to bring into the mix because like I said, I don't necessarily see the synergistic there are probably some synergistic opportunities that Cisco thought that they could capture by acquiring Cerner and kind of move into that space as a future revenue grower. But that still kind of is going to be determined to see because like I said, the acquisition didn't necessarily make 100% sense to me. It's not something that I could have predicted, only because Cisco is such a large player in like the enterprise, and I don't necessarily know how they kind of wanted to touch into an EHR. I'll be honest though, the EHR market at one point in its history was flooded with incumbents. Like there were
Mm,
just so many different ones, and um, now there's actually a lot of consolidation that's happening, and Cerner being the number two in the in that regard, uh, does command a lot of what's the word? Like a lot of influence over the healthcare sector. So if I had to guess, I'd say that's Oracle is probably saying, well, you know what, you already have our EHR. Let's kind of introduce you to some of our other softwares that may end up integrating into your platform and just make you better and make you bigger. So it's almost like acquire. I don't want to say acquiring future customers, but it could be acquiring some future customers. Like I said, there's probably some synergies that we're not exactly in line to see right now, but eventually they'll come down. And also from a Cerner perspective, it really makes sense too, because when you have a company like Cisco, I mean
Oracle.
Oracle,
Yeah.
sorry,
Hmm.
who's got a tremendous amount of weight in the industry and some cat, like a lot of cash. That means that you can invest in more of your own products to make it better, and maybe even take over some market share from Epic. I mean, there was a giant VA contract not too long ago that Epic lost and Cerner actually got.
Mm.
So if that's an indicator of some kind of like what's the word, some weaknesses on Epic side, you may be number one today, but if your competitors partnered with a much larger company and they have some resources, they have some influence over some decision makers, you may end
Yep.
up you may you may end up losing that number one spot. Who knows?
Yeah, the deal came onto my radar because I track initiatives like IBM Watson Health, which was sort of this AI service solution that IBM was trying to push into healthcare, but ultimately flopped. And we don't know what the reason for that was. If you think about AI and machine learning, how much potential there is for that type of technology, and then you
I, I
think
can
about.
I can give you some clear insights into why I think it failed.
Tell me, talk to me.
Um, if you've ever worked in the healthcare industry, one of the things that you'll definitely see is there is a lack of there is a lack of understanding how beneficial technologies are. And if you especially if you've kind of like worked in a siloed environment for a prolonged period of time as a physician, what ends up happening is you get used to certain things. And once you get used to certain things, you don't want change. Healthcare systems are probably one of the areas where it's really, really hard to get people to buy into new things and change. They're used to doing things a certain way and they want to keep doing a certain way. And they also, you need to there's especially right now, there's a level of confidence that you have to get them to go over the fence to get them to adopt a product. Right now, that confidence was not there. I don't think IBM was able to provide the physicians with enough confidence in the product to
Yep.
get them to adopt it 100%. And that's one of the things that I've seen in my line of work, where I've had to implement new softwares that were radical and transformative, but at the same time I've had no buy-in from the physicians or the supporting staff of the physicians. So when you don't have that, or as great as your technology is, it's not going to make any difference. People will be set in their ways and they will set your product up to fail. I'll give you an example. There was a company that not too long ago reached out to my organization, and they were just asking for my input, about, like, oh, we have this great product. I think you guys would be a perfect candidate to use it. And I had to be honest with them, and I just said, no, I don't think this is the right, like, we're not the right organization for at this moment. We're still very early in our digital transformation journey, and if you try to adopt something, it's going to fail massively. You're going to commit too many resources to it. There's no clear indication for success right now because we have so many other things going on. It's probably not the right time to do it. The other thing is, we are a much, much larger system. So you don't want to try to implement a new product into a giant system. You want to do it with smaller facilities, smaller hospitals, maybe even organizations that have a much smaller scale, so that this way you can learn, because they were very early in their business development cycle, right? So the thing is, like, why would you go after big fish? If you're still early in your development cycle, you want to use the smaller opportunities to learn. You want to,
Right.
understand what people like, what people don't like. If you need to modify your product to kind of like fit in what people want, you should do that. So literally after like 30 minutes, they were like, yeah, you're right. We never even thought of it. We just thought, well, if we land a big whale of a contract with a big organization, that'll just look really good. And I'm like, no, if you really want long-term sustained growth, you need to get a product that not only works, but people are willing to adopt. And then on top of that, be able to not have as many public failures. The last thing you want is public failure. Like, literally, that is the biggest, and that's something that actually happened to Palantir, right? Palantir ended up getting in over its head with some of these companies in 2014, 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16. And they had a lot of high profile clients say, hey, listen, your product is not necessarily the greatest thing in the world that you claimed it to be, and we think that we can do something better ourselves. And that was honestly a very big flop on Palantir's part, right? So one of the things is, you have to, when you're trying to adopt new software, or any product for that matter, but software especially, you definitely have to look at counterparty risk to see how how your counterparty is going to adopt it. If there's no buy-in from executive leadership, you're dead right there. Don't even bother, because you know what? They won't push for it, you know. And then on top of it, you have to gauge like the level of competence among the staff there too, because I think that's the other thing. There is a learning gap and a skills gap that has to exist prior to you being able to adopt it. And I think a lot of the AI software, and a lot of software in general, like, you go back 10 years, maybe even 15 years, there were not enough people in healthcare that even knew how to use email. Now it's like a normal thing. So now if you try to convince them to use a newer software, you'd probably get a lot more adoption. So now the time has actually come where a lot of companies can come in and disrupt the space. The timing was, ideas were around this technology, and a lot of great technology was around since the early 2000s, right? The thing is, though, the prerequisite of, getting people, how do I say, more technologically savvy people involved, wasn't around till maybe about 5 years ago, where people kind of understood the value of certain technologies that are coming around. So yeah, I'm sorry. I think I'm leading the discussion into another another time
No,
zone.
no
So
worries.
let's go with the original questions you were asking.
I think before, yeah, well, before we get to Palantir, I know people want us to get to Palantir because that's what we have in the header here. But I think you raise a good point in terms of deploying AI and machine learning to healthcare is that you oftentimes don't have the buy-in from the physicians. And what I've seen is a lack. I think the big point there is just a lack of explainable insights. So it's one thing to show a physician a recommendation, but then they have to explain it to a patient, and they're also on the hook because they have to sign off on it. So you better show your work when it
Yeah.
comes to why you came to that conclusion. And if the physician or the nurse practitioner is not 100% comfortable, they're just not going to use it and just going to go with the status quo.
Yeah.
What's the best way to do that? What's like how should people be thinking about that buy-in in terms of making sure that the doctors are going to be comfortable with it?
To be fair, I think what it is you need champions among industry, right? You need people who have a lot of credibility, who can actually speak to colleagues and be able to convince them that this product is actually worth using. That typically happens when you think about different pharmaceuticals, like pharmaceuticals, like drugs, right? So when you have like different new products, you have clinical people actually go and not they don't do the selling, but they actually will speak to their counterpart physician. So a cardiologist who's has 40 years of experience, dealing with patients with certain conditions, that person is much more credible when someone says to you, or someone says to you, hey, listen, this medicine is really good, these are the benefits, versus some 20-year-old or 30-year-old salesperson just coming to your office and saying, hey, I have this great product, here's all the research data on it. Doctors are not going to sit there and try to read all these clinical datas and everything else. They're literally going to say, hey, it's a lot of, you'd be surprised at how much medicine is still word of mouth, right? So
Right.
it's the same kind of situation with regards to software. So if you get a level of adoption, and especially someone who's very influential, they can say, hey, look, we have this great product that we're using, maybe you guys should consider using it. And that's how a lot of softwares right now that we're acquiring, that's how they came to us, where what the developers actually reached out to the physicians. They said, look, we will work with you guys to let you see what the product is like. And that person ended up becoming the champion for the rest of the organization. And now all the other physicians are like reaching out and it's like, okay, yeah, let's do it. So I think right now, if you need adoption, the first thing is you need to identify influential people within the industry that can help the process along. So, oh, and just to touch back on the IBM Watson thing, they're just too early. That's, if I had to say anything, they were too early in their development cycle. Not too early in their development cycle. They're too early trying to implement something that the world was not ready for.
The
You
timing,
know,
right.
yeah, the timing was off. And that's the same thing with a lot of industry, right? Where you can have a revolutionary product, but you also need to let the general market catch up to it before it becomes a big thing. I think, when you look at the tech bubble of the early 2000s, that should give you a good idea of what it is. Everyone knew the internet was going to be a big thing. So how come all these internet companies, they failed? Well, that's because people weren't ready at the time. People weren't exactly like 100%. Not everyone even had a computer at the time.
Right.
Yet you were like, hey, this is going to be a revolutionary product. So that's the whole thing about AI too, and machine learning, where I think we're just starting to enter the area of where I think people are starting to see the value in it and actually be more open to adopting it within their enterprise.
Yeah, I think we're also as practitioners getting smarter. Like if I think about IBM Watson Health, there was maybe a little bit of an underappreciation of the lack of data and the data silos that exists in healthcare, probably a little bit less of an appreciation for the business model, the idea that you can't always match inputs with outputs. So I provide a service as a healthcare practitioner to a patient, and then how do I measure whether or not that service was effective? It's very hard for me to
Yeah.
do that, right? They only
Yeah.
come back if they get sick. But if they get better and I did a good job, they don't come back. But I don't see that in my data set. So
Yeah.
I think as AI and machine learning practitioners, we're getting smarter about that too, and appreciating that 80% of the battle is going to be about wrangling different data sources, getting the privacy folks comfortable with the
Yeah.
management, the controls, and all that. And then the last bit is the AI and the insights, and that's the cherry on top. But you still have all this upfront work that you have to do to
Yeah.
get people comfortable. I think that's a good segue to Palantir. Tell me about what's the bull case for Palantir? Why are people so excited about this company?
So I think the biggest bull case of Palantir is the fact that they're they're sort of completely new in a lot of the ways that they're doing things. I think a lot of people still associate them as being just a data analytics platform, like outside of the whole retail thing. But to some degree, retail understands that there is a tremendous amount of data that's being generated, right? They don't know who's going to win the data AI race, and even I don't 100% know Palantir is going to win. But the thing is, from what we can see, and all the presentations and everything that we're reading and also their involvement with the governments, we know that Palantir probably has one of the higher chances of becoming that disruptive technology that's going to rule the AI and ML space, right? The prerequisites for it's almost like Tesla, and I see a lot of people that were Tesla. I don't want to say Tesla bulls, but they were literally very interested in Tesla early in its cycle, and everyone told them Tesla was going to fail, Tesla would not exist. Electric cars are dead. There's no way that you can make this a profitable venture. So there was a lot of that same thinking is happening with regards to Palantir from the Wall Street side, where a lot of people are saying, well, you guys are just a data mining company. Like, we don't see the revenues, like, you don't see the profitability, that you're not growing as fast as some of the other companies like Snowflake and so on. So the same arguments that were made with regards to Tesla are kind of being made with Palantir. And I think retail sees that and saying, look, we were able to best Wall Street at one time with Tesla. We can do it again with
Mm,
Palantir, right? Where Wall Street is fundamentally not necessarily understanding a lot of the benefits that Palantir can bring to us in the future. Just like how electric cars, everyone thought electric cars were going nowhere, right? Until Tesla came out. And Tesla was not the first electric car manufacturer. There were other companies that were working in the space, but Wall Street just wrote them off and said, look, there's no way you guys can be profitable, that we just don't see it. And they were able to prove them wrong. And I think retail saw that. And now retail is looking for another Tesla. And I
mm,
think they found it in Palantir. If one of the things that you'll see, one of the correlations that I've seen is that if you look at the number of people who are bullish on Palantir, they're also, majority of them hold positions in Tesla, and they were
right,
bullish on Tesla prior to 2019. So there
right.
might be a little bit of a confirmation bias there also, where it's almost like we were able to pick up on one thing, so we're going to pick up on another, and it just kind of turned into like a, what's the word, like a superstorm of confirmation bias and echo
Right.
chambers, kind of just like coming together. And like I said, it's just one of those things that like I said, that's not necessarily the bull case for Palantir, but that's why Palantir is probably so much more of a retail darling, because a lot of the same people who were bullish on Tesla are bullish on Palantir.
That's
I don't know
right.
if you've noticed. I don't know if you've noticed that.
I've noticed that too. I like on the Twitter on the Twitter threads I see not Twitter threads but in Twitter I see a lot of like I hold two stocks, Tesla and Palantir, 50-50, or I hold three assets, Dogecoin, Tesla, and Palantir. And that's like my long-term strategy. I see a lot of that. Yeah, somebody commented here, did you just say that Palantir is the next Tesla? And well, you're not saying that, but you're saying that that seems to be kind of the theme, right? Like a lot of people that are bullish on Tesla and were early on bullish in Tesla before it was hip, before they were like the monster that they
Yeah.
are today. They were out there like in the trenches, slinging arrows and trying to convince people that Tesla was like gonna be amazing. And here we are. Tesla is like the number one car company in the world
Yep.
by market cap, and they're getting into Tesla bots, and they're doing full self-driving cars. Like they're
Yep.
just going to be a monster to come. And so I guess what if we follow that same analogy, that Tesla, the way that Tesla differentiated themselves was through innovative manufacturing techniques by hitting on electric vehicles and doing it better than anybody else. Like that's kind of their core competency, and being lean and just pushing out product. What are the similar concepts for Palantir that are going to make them different, that are going to have that people consider them that are going to help them dominate the space the way that Tesla does today?
So I think the first thing is going to be number one is going to be innovative approaches to enter different markets, right? There's a ton of companies out there that call themselves AI companies, right? And they just they have a product that's, how do I say without really sounding too like offensive, but they're very niche in the way that they are doing things. And because of that, they'll never really see that they don't have that core technology to get them to a point where they can be, adopted everywhere. I think there's only two companies right now that I see that have a product that can be kind of like maximized uh, all over and pretty much in a tons of use cases. And number one is Google, and the other one is Palantir. They have so many companies that they're working with so many different industries, right? So the way that I would say it is, imagine someone trying to sell you a meal that's 100% like, hey, I'll sell you a pizza. Palantir is not selling you pizza. They're saying, hey, we'll sell you a business that can make pizzas, that can make, you know, potato chips, that can make you this thing. We can make you that thing, right? So it just seems that there's more approach to general things, like outside of just that one niche of a thing, like, oh, we're an AI software company that primarily focuses on healthcare, right? Or we're an AI company that specifically focuses on self-driving cars. Palantir is like, no, we'll do everything. We'll figure out a way that we can incorporate ourselves to give you insights into your own business, but then also our platform will be able to kind of maximize the potential of the data that you're already collecting. The other thing is, a lot of people are also bullish on the fact that, everyone keeps saying data is the new oil, data is the new oil. You know, yes, that's true. Data is the new oil, but just like oil, if you don't refine it, it's just black liquid sitting in it. Back in the day, in the 1900s, people used to just literally, you'd have oil. People used to toss it away because it was
Right.
like, this is just a useless liquid that we found in the ground. It was until they started to realize the value of the products that came from that oil started to become gold, right? So it's kind of the same thing right now. I see in my line of work all this data collection that we have. We have tons of data collection mechanisms. Like I cannot tell you the amount of money that my company probably spends on gathering data, right? Whether it be patient data, data on different aspects of our healthcare delivery system. And the thing is, though, most of it is useless. It's really, really useless. It has no real value whatsoever to most people, unless you aggregate it and you contextualize it, where you're actually asking the right person to interpret that data. And once you have that person interpret that data, it ends up becoming huge, right? It ends up becoming almost like a game changer. So an example is, um, like the winter that Napoleon invaded Russia. Who cares what the temperature outside of Moscow was, for the most part, for those years. But then imagine the year that Napoleon was around, if he had the insights to say, hey, in the last 100 years, Moscow was this cold during this time, and if I invade at this time, I better make sure my soldiers have winter clothes. That makes huge difference, right? So what does the temperature in Moscow mean to most people? Nothing, unless you're trying to invade Moscow. Then it means a lot, right? So
Right.
it's the same thing with data, where most data is completely useless unless you actually can find someone who's going to be able to utilize it to make something of it. So I think right now Palantir is doing that, in that they're able to take all that data, put it into a giant ball of something, and then give you the ability to create applications on top of it to actually make it a usable product, right? Which is the same thing. Like, you're basically refining data. So that's what they're doing. If I had to say Palantir's business, what is it? I'd say they're data refiners.
I think that's a good point. It's a good analogy. You're right. Data is a new oil. That's a meme that's going around. But to your point around history, the wildcatters, the folks that were out there drilling for oil, that was a terrible business. That was a boom bust business where it was like shrinking margins and they're like not doing so well. It was the refiners that really did well. John D. Rockefeller and Standard
Yep.
Oil, they would collect the oil from all the wildcatters and they would process it and take it to market. And without that component, you don't really have the oil industry, at least the way, or the petroleum, no, sorry, the gasoline and kerosene industry that we saw back then. So you're correct.
There was a show on History Channel about 5 or 6 years ago that really like caught my eye, and I really liked it. And I don't know if anyone here is on listening, but if you do get a chance, it's called I think it's called The Men Who Made America, right? And one of the profiles that they have is John D. Rockefeller and how he built Standard Oil and some of the things that he had to do to get it to become Standard Oil and why that ended up becoming the most valuable company on the planet, right? So it's kind of this, I think if you really want to see some insights into certain people and the way that they're thinking, I recommend you guys look that up, The Men Who Built America, and watch the John D. Rockefeller episode. All of them are really good. They have the other industrialists too, but I think the Rockefeller one was probably my favorite.
Yeah, there's also a good biography on him called Titan by, I think it's Ron Chernow. I have it there. Titan. Oh my gosh, absolute great read.
I'm gonna actually look that one. What is it called? Titan?
Titan. By
Okay.
Ron Chernow. I think he also, yeah, he's a big time biographer. He has a couple other ones out there, but highly recommended. One of my favorite books. It's all about John D. Rockefeller, from like where he starts, where he comes from nothing. Like this guy's like, he has
Yeah.
to like work hard just to get
Hey
a
Manny, I think your sound is a little low if you want to turn it up.
yeah. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, I don't think it's better.
All right, perfect. Um, it talks about where he started, how he had to struggle just to get like in a clerkship at an accounting shop, and how he went from there to like being the most powerful, richest man in America. Really great biography. Highly recommended. So I think that's a good point, and in part that's what impresses me about Palantir is that they do put the focus on streamlining that process of going from raw data to and trying to map it to some sort of ontology that makes sense within the organization, and then adding analytics capabilities and machine learning on top of that. But the focus is, hey, let's get in there, let's plug into your system, let's make sense of this data, let's contextualize it. That's going to be 80% of the work. That's what we send in these forward deployed engineers, and then we're going to add the insights on top of that. Do you have a sense of how they're doing that? In terms of what is IP? What are the techniques that are helping them stand out in that respect in terms of mapping to that raw data? And I guess the other thing I would ask is, do you have a sense of how scalable that is? Because it's one thing to do that for a hospital, but then you have to turn around and do the same process for a manufacturer, a refiner. Those are all going to be different instances, different data sources. How scalable is that? Any commentary there?
So I think when they were working with the government, they had a much more siloed approach with all the data, right? Where a lot of that data was siloed in different locations with different agencies, and they were able to figure out ways to get that data to be combined, right? Where it could be easily shared among services, it could be easily shared among different agencies. Now, the key differentiator between that model and the one that we're seeing now is that before you used to have a lot of physical FDEs, like forward deployed engineers, go there, massage that data, massage the pipeline to create like what you needed to do. Um, what they've done recently, especially after 2016 and 2017, is automate that a little bit, right? And using AI and all these other software tools that they have. So you have SDDI, just software defined data integration. And they realize that. And a lot of the things that they came up with, a lot of products that they came up with in the last 4 and 5 years, really now enable them to scale out. Before they might had they had definitely had a scaling problem, I would say, in 2015 and 16, but they were able to pretty much come up with new products that allow them to scale to new industries and newer things. I don't know 100% how far they've come along in that, but from the demo presentations, from what I've seen, one of their products that they have is something called Hyper Auto, right? Hyper Auto they understood that there's only so many ERP systems that companies have to do their resource planning. And every time we go into a new company, we're just doing the same exact work over and over again, right? So let's create a product that helps us kind of just like work out of the box where, the same data sets are being applied because you're using that same ERP. So the example is your SAP data sets, your Oracle data sets. A lot of the ERP systems are based on those. So why not just build a product that understands the ERP data from Oracle? And there you go. Anytime you go into a new company, those same contexts are going to apply. So the same thing. So now you have that data. So you're not literally massaging that data anymore, where you're literally just going in there and you're plugging and playing, or you're limiting the amount of people that you're sending out. And that's one of the highlights I think Alex Karp mentioned in one of the presentations, where he said, we've been able to scale, but we haven't had to add as many staff or as many personnel to scale up to a higher amount. One of the big things about Alex Karp that he's really trying to do right now is kind of keep that culture together. And the one thing that typically, and I've seen this in not just software, but any company, is the more people you hire, the further away you get from that original culture that pretty much made you who you are today. And that's kind of the same thing that he's actually worried about right now, which is he's not trying to add to the headcount, because the minute you keep adding more and more to the headcount, you're losing your bottom line. Of course, that's another thing. But more importantly, you're introducing a lot more variables into your culture. There has been news that they're expanding out their sales force, but from what I can tell, they're trying to really segregate the two aspects of that business, where the salespeople stay on one side and the people who do the development work and the software work stay on the other side. Because, to be honest with you, and I kind of agree with that, because did you ever see the TV show Silicon Valley? You remember that episode where they tried to bring in some salespeople into Pied Piper, and basically they were like, "Hey, I'm Jan the man," and they would just keep repeating themselves, and then they were trying to sell a product, and they were trying to tell the developers what to do in order to sell the product, right? But that's not how software should work. It should be the developers doing their job, and then telling the salespeople, "Hey, this is what the capabilities are. Please sell the product." And the salespeople are supposed to figure out how to sell it to the customer, but then also come back with feedback, so that this way you can tell the developer, "Hey, listen, I got feedback from this customer that this was successful and this wasn't," so they can modify a little bit. From what I could tell watching the show, Carp is probably worried that the same thing is going to happen, where they're going to lose out on their core mission if they have all these salespeople. And that's one of the reasons why they never really had a big sales team in the first place, and why he did most of the sales himself. But I think, to the point, to Palantir's point, they understand that now they're going to need a sales force to kind of like go and sell their product. So, but they're still doing their best to kind of segment those two parts of like I guess the business right now.
Can you hear me at all, Kris?
Yeah, I can
Okay.
hear you now. It was
Okay.
a lot lower before.
All right. All right.
Yeah.
I switched mics. So I think we're okay. Thank you everybody for that help. Um all right, that makes sense. You expect how would we see that? What's the best way to prove that out? Because that to me is kind of one of the key questions for any AI data management company is how do you show me how you scale this across each different company without having an army of forward deployed engineers?
So I would say the first thing that you would want to do is have industry partners within an industry, right? Who are going to use your product, and they'll be your prime example, right? So an example is, if you're doing anything in aviation, Airbus is your prime person, right? They have a lot of downstream customers, so they'll end up adopting the product because the person or the supplier at the top is the one that kind of told them like, "Hey, this is a great product. You guys should use it," right? Same thing if you look at a lot of the businesses that they partner with, they have downstream customers, right?
Right.
So you want that credibility to start off, right there. And then you can kind of downstream that into all the smaller players within that industry. So right now, another really big partnership was BP, right? So if they're using BP, right? And Palantir, I mean, BP loves Palantir. That means that other people, not just competitors, but companies that are counterparties to BP, are gonna want to use them because they're gonna say, "Well, look, BP's doing really well." That means that they know what's going on in the oil industry, right? They can build products that help optimize production, right? Let's get them into our ecosystem so they could do the same for us. What's good about Palantir is that because they've already done all the hard lifting, with BP, the next company that's in the same industry, you won't have to do as much because there's already a model built, right? So it's almost like the first time you build a house, it's going to be really hard, right? The second time you build a house, it's not going to be as hard. The third time you build a house, even less. So, and by the time you get to your 100th house, it's literally like second nature, you know.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
just
they
like the
have
person just said, a flywheel.
they had a similar arrangement with Airbus, I think, right? With a system called Skywise,
Yep.
where I think from what I gather, they partner with Airbus and then they build out different services for Airbus's customers. And I really like that approach because, to your point, you're leveraging industry expertise. You're having them help you build out the ontologies and the systems and how they have to map to a common framework. And then two, you're building credibility within that industry. Like, hey, we're not just a generic data platform that's coming into this space. We're partnering with one of the biggest players in airline manufacturing, Airbus, to
Yep.
provide you this service. The third thing
Exactly.
that I like about it is that you're having a big player in the space rev share in a way,
Hmm.
participate in the upside, and that is very powerful motivation and incentive. I think people vastly underappreciate how important that is. I've been a part of deals where you really haven't seen that, where you've actually seen the counter. Where I worked with the manufacturer, where we were going to build an AI service to help their machines work better, but they also had a ton of revenue coming in from services. So there was a lot of like inner like fighting around like, well, why am
Yep.
I going to help you predict this thing, but it's also going to cost me in service revenue? And you see that in a lot of places. So if you're providing the technology, you better show the direct upside from for them in terms of deploying it to their customers and within their organization. So I think I think that's a really good
Here's
way
here's
to
one
approach it.
here's one dirty little secret, I guess, of not a lot of people. If you don't work in some of the industries, the money, especially the lucrative money, does not come from hardware sales. Okay. If you think Airbus is making a ton of money on manufacturing just the plane itself, they're not. Okay. The cost of manufacturing the plane, when you plus the development cycle, all the stuff that comes with it, the margins are not there. The high margin revenue comes from supporting that platform, which is the
Right.
plane, and
Right.
all the other subsystems that go along with it. So an example is software, different hardware pieces that you have that are generically manufactured for pennies on the dollar, but you sell back to the airline for hundreds, if not two, at a huge markups. I see that in the healthcare industry right now in radiology, where there are a lot of companies that are willing to take a bath on you buying an MRI machine up front. They don't make that much money on it. But guess what? Those service contracts, they're lucrative. And if you have them for 5 years, you can't buy an MRI machine without having a really good service contract attached to it. Because if anything happens to that machine and you need a part, they're going to charge you an arm and a leg for that one little part that's going to cost you literally almost like about a third of the machine.
Right.
So a lot of those service contracts, and those service contracts are super high margin revenue contracts. So it's the kind of the same thing a little bit, where you can sell the product for super cheap, but then the support services you can make a ton of money on. So right now I think Palantir realized that and said, okay, look, let's work with some of these companies. An example is another good one is Hyundai, right? With the shipbuilder, where the ship is going to be built by Hyundai, of course, and everything. But then all the subsystems, all the parts, and everything else, Hyundai is going to be able to partner with Palantir to say, "Hey, look, your ship needs a new rotor because the data that's the sensor for that ship tells you that, hey, this is not going to last another year or two, so please buy a new product, right? Same thing with Skywise right now, where a lot of that data, those sensors, everything else tells the airlines, hey, you need to buy a new product, or a new what is that thing called, a new piece of widget or something for the plane, right? Let's get it integrated, let's get new things on it. So I think a lot right now, Palantir is helping large manufacturers create platforms so that this way they can kind of benefit from that. And the best way to do it is by giving customers at the bottom level visibility into into like some of the things that they need to do to change, right? And then also kind of, how do I best describe it? It's almost like, if it's almost like your car, right? Right now you're not necessarily going to buy a new part for your car, a new engine belt or timing belt, or you're not going to do this. But imagine you have an app that tells you, hey, your timing belt is about to um, pretty much break down, you should change it as a preventive maintenance. You're more likely to go and buy a new timing belt. You're not going to wait until that timing belt breaks, right?
Right.
So it's kind of the same system where right now Airbus goes to the airlines and say, look, you don't want downtime, you don't want parts to break down. Here's a product that's going to tell you, hey, your plane is about to, not be it's not going to work because this product may end up becoming faulty in the next, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 months. So guess
Right.
what they do? They order that new part. They install it so that you don't have that downtime, you don't have that disruption. And the
Right.
business says, look, if I don't have that disruption, that just adds to my bottom line again. So people are more likely to do more preventative things because they have the data to do it. So they're
Yeah.
not waiting for problems to develop. They're solving problems before they start.
Yeah, and it's also helping these manufacturers change their revenue mix a little bit in two ways. One is, like, you can actually sell software now as a service, like Tesla. Somebody brought up a good point in the chat. Like, if you look at what Tesla is doing on hardware, okay, there's some good margins there, but that is going to pale in comparison to their software revenue in a couple of years when FSD is
Yep.
full steam. Oh my gosh. And that is like high margin, like
Yeah.
high margin business, and they're just going to be printing cash if that goes the way that I think it's going to go. And then if you think about Tesla bot and all these other things, software is going to be a big revenue driver. But also, I've seen companies change the nature of their widgets, as well as, instead of selling the actual machinery, they sell usage to that machinery, if that makes sense. So I'm not,
Hmm.
if I'm Airbus, I'm not going to sell you the airplane. I'm going to sell you miles in the air, provided by one of my airplanes, and you just pay me for a guaranteed amount of mileage, and however much you use it, you pay me for that. Kind of like the AWS model, where you pay as you
Yeah.
go, kind of thing, that you couldn't do in the past. And you can
Yeah.
do that now because you have access to the data. You can anticipate things. You can replace things before it. And customers really love that. No capex. It's all just SaaS revenue. And companies love it because, of course, it's SaaS revenue.
Mhm.
Everybody loves SaaS revenue.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. Like the other thing with Tesla is that I think a lot of people have started to realize that they're not just a car company anymore. That they've got so many different verticals, not just, and even software. That's another big one that you just said. Now they have an insurance product because guess what? Who Tesla has the most refined data when it comes to their users from their driving habits, because every one of their sensors is telling you who's a good driver and who's doing burnouts in the middle of the city, right? So guess what? Now like this person insurable, this person's not insurable. The risk premium to this person should be way higher than someone who's here, and there's no hiding it now either. Where
Right.
before, how would an insurance company measure what your insurance rate was? Well, what you tell them plus some of the history in the back. Now Tesla knows everything that you do. Like literally from the minute you leave your garage to the minute you come home at night, they see everything, right?
Right.
They see that you're stopping at your stoplights. You're Like I said, I think Tesla in their insurance is going to make them a crap ton of money. That is just free cash flow that's going to keep growing, keep growing. So I
Well,
think right now, yeah, go ahead.
sorry to
Sorry.
interrupt, but there's a reason why Warren Buffett bought Geico Insurance. Why
Yeah.
the one of the most savviest investor has an insurance company, because that is, if you do it right, it's very profitable, and you generate a lot of float because you're taking in premiums,
Yep.
and then you don't have to pay that out until there's an accident. What are you going to do with that cash money? You're
Reinvest it.
going to invest it in the business, other places. So
Yep.
that's going to be another bonkers thing for Tesla. It's going to be crazy, and it's only possible because they have that clarity on the data. To your point, whereas other
Mm.
insurance companies, they're using antiquated heuristics like, oh, you're an 18-year-old in a sports car and you come from this zip code, then your premium is going to be this. Like, come on,
Yeah.
give me a break. Like, you got to evolve past that.
Yeah.
So here's another kind of key theme that I wanted you to comment on, Kris. My sense is that um, the companies that go real bonkers are riding waves in the zeitgeist, so to speak, and if you look at Tesla, they were riding the electric vehicle wave, and that's kind of gotten there. And if I look at Palantir, I feel like one of the waves that they might be riding is this wave on privacy, this kind of return of like, or this appreciation that the data that we're providing to some companies, maybe we should be a little bit more careful about that. Maybe we should, have more ownership of that, more visibility. And if I think about the companies that did well before this new era, I think of Google, I think of Facebook. Facebook, for sure, they know everything about you and they share that, and you kind of really don't know how that works. And when I think about companies that are trying to ride this wave of increased privacy, I think of Apple and I think of Palantir. Like Palantir, because they've been in the government space, they have this notion of like being really careful about who tracks or who has access to each data source, data provenance throughout the entire system, and that's core to their value prop, right? Like, we're like really
Mhm.
good about this. And Apple, of course, that just seems to have been one of their key themes over the last, I'd say, 3 years, is like privacy, 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 and it's starting to affect companies like Facebook. Like Apple just updated their OS, and you saw what happened to Facebook this past week on earnings. Took a nosedive. A lot of that is because you're not able to track people on the Apple platform as much as you were able to do in the past. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about that. Do you feel like that's like a key driver? You feel like Palantir is really plugged into that?
So, yeah, I definitely think so. I think when you're trying to commoditize and productize individuals' habits, that's not necessarily the most moral or ethical way of doing things. I mean, I can understand the logic in it because, you can have a much more focused way of reaching consumers. The problem that tends to happen when it comes to that is that you lose your you lose yourself like as an individual, and you basically become almost like a collective body that can be kind of like dictated to a little bit, right? Where it went from, yes, we're collecting this data to understand consumer habits so we can sell you things, to now we're collecting your data so that we can figure out ways to influence you into buying things. And that's where I think the biggest problem lies, where I don't need to be influenced, or I don't want to be influenced into buying things. And you can see it all throughout your life. I don't know how many times you've had a conversation with someone, and I don't know if your phone is listening, or one of your devices is listening, and automatically you look on your page and you're like, wait a second, how am I being suggested this product now?
Right.
Because I was having a very minor conversation with someone regarding that. I
Couple
found
times,
that to
yeah.
be really
Weird.
creepy and intrusive
Right.
into how things are being done. So I think a lot of people are waking up to that, and that they don't necessarily want to be influenced into doing things, right? And I think that's a bad business model. But if you're trying to understand consumer habits so that you can stay ahead of the curve, that's fine. But when you go from understanding consumers to influencing consumers, that's when you have problems, and that's where that's where I think a lot of what's going to happen in the next probably the next 10 years. It's going to be big, where I think a lot of companies, I mean, are well a lot of regulations might be coming down the pipeline with regards to how much consumer data should be collected by any given company, whether that be Facebook, Google, so on and so forth, and be able to that data could be sold to third parties, or sold to pretty much other governments, right? That's the other thing that a lot of people are concerned about. Where I think Palantir fits into this is that they're number one, they're not nearly as concerned with consumer habits, right? Most of their business right now is all around enterprise. So they're working with businesses to pretty much understand business and how they operate. So the amount of fallout that Palantir can see from this what's the word, this kind of this degradation in influence peddling, you're not going to see that. Like Palantir doesn't actively go out there and try to sell you a pantyhose. Like that's not their business model. They will help you figure out how to make more pantyhose if your customers are really liking this pantyhose and you need to figure out a supply chain to get that pantyhose to be, manufactured from 30 days to 10 days. But they're not necessarily trying to sell you pantyhose, whereas companies like Amazon and Facebook are. Um, so that's one area that I think we just have to distinguish the two to say, okay, Palantir is not an influence peddler that other companies that are taking a beating right now are. The other thing with it is that Palantir could probably take a lot of other data sets that are not traditionally that important, and basically combine them with other data sets to create actual products that have actual real world value other than just selling you a product. So an example is, I'll give you something in healthcare, right? In healthcare right now, one of the things that we have is new drugs come to market. But before new drugs come to market, you have to go through clinical trials. You have to see what the market potential for product is. So one of the things that you really need is to figure out, okay, how am I going to create a cohort of people who are going to be part of this clinical trial? Well, all that data already exists. There's tons of people out there that have certain diseases, right? But all that data is everywhere. All the hospitals have them. So, how do you protect people's privacy, right? By taking all that data, putting it together into a subset where then you can say, okay, I am going to create a product and I can focus that product in a certain area, certain region, and then work with the hospitals that are my partners to do it. So, an example is with this COVID-19, the government cared what the total number of COVID infections were. They weren't necessarily concerned with who has COVID. If right now the government was trying to figure out who has COVID and then go after them and try to quarantine them like how China did it, that's bad, right? So you need to protect that privacy aspect where healthcare should always, like healthcare especially, should always be private. But there's tremendous amounts of value in aggregating that data and being able to take that other part out so that you can actually create something that's going to be beneficial to society as a whole. So right now, I think that's one great example of how Palantir was able to successfully help. Sorry, just called me. Hello. Yeah. So that's one example that I would say, like COVID-19. If there's one thing that COVID-19 proved with regards to Palantir is that you could safely work with all these end users, who are the hospitals, get all this data, put it together in a very data private way where people are not going to lose their identity, right? Or
Yeah.
identity is not going to be revealed. And then you're going to be able to make public health decisions based on all the data that's being aggregated. So imagine that data going to a pharmaceutical company right now to say, look, there are a total number, there's like 50,000 total cases of influenza within a certain region, right? Let's work on getting, clinical trials set up in that area. So now that influenza doesn't spread further. I'm not saying influenza is going to be localized, but basically they'll be able to kind of figure out what key markets that they need to focus on. So there's still tremendous amount of value that's out there. It's just Palantir can do it in a very, how do I say it? I don't even know how to really word it. How to do it in a very safe manner where you're not losing your individuality.
Yeah, I guess I would say in a they would be able to do it from theoretically, of course, because I haven't had any experience with the Palantir software. I just want to make that clear. I'm gonna try to get my hands on Foundry sometime soon. But theoretically, the way that it would work is you create a trusted ecosystem in which different institutions can contribute their data in an anonymized way,
Yeah. Yep.
or protected way. And you can also control access to the data so that you're making sure that the right people are getting the right level of access. And B and C, you can track where that data is going and how it's being used. So
Right.
you have full visibility on where that data is going. It's not like right now, like I input my data into a platform. I don't know where it's going. I don't know who it's being sold to. I don't know who else is participating in that.
Yeah.
Like you cannot have that in certain spaces within industry like healthcare. You just can't. You have
Yeah.
HIPAA compliance things. You just can't do it. And
Yeah.
B, those companies don't want to take the risk. They don't want
Yeah.
to. They don't want to be on the line for sharing that data. And then C, they also want to participate in the revenue if something comes about that. So
Yeah.
like you can be a hospital providing your data to this pool, and you can say, oh, you use my data to create that new drug. Can we get a dividend off of that? Can we like participate in
Yeah.
that? So for all those reasons, I can see the framework that Palantir is trying to leverage and what they're trying to do being effective in those spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Totally.
Okay, Kris, we're at time. Um, Hour just flew by. I think we're gonna have to do a round two sometime later. I really enjoyed the conversation. Any last thoughts? Do you want to maybe tell us about where people can find you, where people can follow your work?
Yeah, you can just follow me on Twitter at Kris Patel 99. I started a YouTube channel about a week and a half ago. I did a very small video just as a trial. If you want, you can subscribe. I'm gonna try to create more content, create more videos. Right now, I'm flying back between New York and Atlanta, so I don't have nearly the amount of time that I would like and to dedicate to new videos. But I always love doing videos like this with content creators. By the way, I don't know how. One of the things that anyone trying to think about they're going to do content creation, is really hard to talk into a camera. Like really, it's just, I'm not saying like it's hard to talk to a person. Like right now, I have Manny in front of me, so it's hard. It's easy for me to talk to him. But when you're just like talking to an animate object like just a camera, it's hard. It's
Right.
hard. And then you have to do all these takes because the first time you get it wrong, you're like, okay, now I'm gonna have to edit this in post, and it takes like 15 minutes to edit something out in post because you have to find that exact time where you stopped talking and the time where you started talking. It's a pain in the butt. So I like content like this. Like I do Joe Rogan's podcast all day, every day. That's easy to do. But then you look at someone like Amit, dude. I don't know how Amit does it. Amit by far is like my favorite YouTuber. I don't know if you've seen him, Amit Kukreja,
No,
right?
now I've got
He's
to
like my
follow him.
favorite. He's my favorite YouTuber right now because man, he just talks really fast and he just gets through a segment, no pauses whatsoever, nothing. And it's almost like I see a lot of YouTubers, they'll like be reading like it sounds like they're reading off of a script, like you should invest in Palantir because their revenues are growing, and then you have, I mean, you should invest in Palantir because their revenues are growing and it's going to be great, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, man, how do you have all the energy? Two, how do you have all that confidence?
Whew.
It's one of those things, man. I guess, and anyone who has some time and they really want to deep dive and understand Palantir, there's another YouTuber. His name is Coach Trap. Just
Cold
look him up.
strap.
Coach Trap is probably by far the most in-depth technical analysis of Palantir that you could get into. So if you really want to understand Palantir's technology, just follow Coach Trap. And if you just have a lot of free time on your hands and you constantly want alerts, follow him.
Cold Strap is amazing.
Yeah,
I'm gonna try to have him on the show sometime soon. But you're right. Like if you want a technical deep dive, and he's a CTO, so he runs these technologies. He has teams. He coaches data engineers, data scientists. So he's a really good perspective on this. And
yeah,
Kris, I should mention that after this I'll put out show notes. So
yeah,
links to the different things that we
yeah.
mentioned, the books, the shows, people like Cold Strap we'll include in the show
Yeah.
notes, and people can definitely go there and check it out.
I'd say also check out Cyberfam because he also gives a lot of great
Cyberfam.
technical insights into the software industry as a whole because he works on the developer side of things. So he yeah, I think on the DevOps side of things. So he understands a lot of how industry works in terms of like software when you're trying to integrate different platforms and all this other stuff. So I think if you have the time, just read on those two people, and they're really good. But Coach, yeah, Dima just said Coach Trap is mandatory. Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
Required viewing. And they're short and they're good. They're entertaining.
Yeah.
He's really
Yep.
good. Cool. So again, those will be in the show notes. We'll share those everywhere after probably Monday. But hey, Kris, thank you so much for coming on the
No,
show. I
no problem,
really
man.
enjoyed our conversation, and let's do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, definitely, man. Take care. Have a good
All
one.
right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Yeah. Take care.